Power Platform data loss prevention policies, or DLP policies, give administrators control over how data is used within Power Platform. But what if multiple DLP policies are applied to the same environment and they differ in how they treat connectors? That's what Manuela is going to show us in this PowerCat Live.
Data loss prevention policies, simply put, isolate which connectors can be used together in a single application or a flow within the Power Platform. They can also be used to block connectors for usage altogether. One of the more complex topics when it comes to data loss prevention policies is the net outcome when multiple policies are applied to one environment, and it's a regular source of questions and confusion. Essentially, what happens in a multi-policy scenario is that all relevant policies that are applied to one environment are evaluated one by one on a single application and a single flow. And in order for an app or flow to successfully run, it must comply to all the DLP policies that are that apply to it. So I want to walk you through two examples so you can see how the final outcome is evaluated when it comes to kind of those multi-policy scenarios. So in the first example, we just have two policies that apply to the same environment, policy A and policy B. In policy A, the admin has put SharePoint, Office 365, and SQL into the business group, Bing Maps, Gmail, and HTTP in the non-business group, and blocked Twitter. So that policy is applied to the environment. And then in the second policy, the admin has put SQL, Gmail, and Bing Maps into the business group, Office 365 and SharePoint into the non-business group, and the HTTP connector is blocked. So let's look at what that means for an application or a flow that is running in the target environment. The net outcome is that Twitter and HTTP are marked as blocked. They're marked as blocked in at least one of the policies, so they cannot be used at all. So the fact that HTTP is part of the non-business group in policy A doesn't have a significance. It's the most restrictive policy that takes place, and because HTTP is blocked in policy B, that takes precedence over it. So that part was easy. Looking at the other connector combinations is a little bit more tricky. So SharePoint and Office 365 users can be used together. That's the combined impact of the business group of policy A and the non-business group of policy B. Both of these connectors are always in the same group together, and that means that they can be used together in an app or a flow. As you can see here, the name of the bucket, so business or non-business, doesn't have any significance. What matters is that those connectors are in the same group. Similarly, Bing Maps and Gmail are in the same group in both of these policies, so they can continue to be used together in an application. And then the SQL connector can only be used on its own. In policy A, the use of the SQL connector is only allowed with Office 365 and SharePoint. And in policy B, SQL is only allowed to be used with Gmail and Bing Maps. Because none of these connector combinations are the same across the groups, and this connector can only be used on its own. So as you can see, even with just two policies applied to one environment, the final outcome was difficult to compute there, and it creates a fragmentation across what can be used in your application and flows. So let's now look a little bit of a more complex scenario, just to walk you through kind of the same process again. So we've got three policies now applied to the target environment, policy A, B, and C, and they are all evaluated when an application or flow is trying to run in that target environment. So let's look at the same kind of the same exercise again, where we split it out into the groups. So the net outcome of three policies applied to one environment is 8 different possible permutations of connector groupings plus a group for the blocked connectors. So you can evaluate the outcome by looking at the different group combinations and confirming which connectors can be used together in each group. And then the most restrictive grouping is finally imposed when all the policies applicable to an environment are evaluated together. So in this scenario where we've got the three policies applied, You can, if I look at the business group in all of these policies, I can see that they only have SharePoint and Office 365 in common. None of the other connectors are, they don't have any other connectors in common. So SharePoint and Office 365 can be used together in an application. Then I look at the two business groups and the non-business groups, and I can see that Azure IoT and Power BI are together in those groups. So I can look at business in policy A in the business group, I've got Azure IoT and Power BI, same in policy B, and then in the non-business group of policy C, I've also got Azure and Power BI. So because these connectors are in the same groups, they can be used together. SQL, it can only be used standalone. It doesn't have any other connectors in common in the same group across all three policies. If I then look at business, non-business, and non-business, I can see that there's none of the connectors are in common, so this group doesn't evaluate to any connectors. If I look at non-business, business, and business, I can see that the Bing Maps connector is the one that these three groups have in common, but none of the other connector combinations. So same as the SQL connector, this connector can only be used standalone. If I look at further permutations, so non-business, business, non-business, and non-business, non-business, business, they don't have any connectors in common either, so they don't evaluate to any connectors that can be used in an application. And then if I look at the three non-business groups, I can see that they've got Translate and Gmail in common, so those two connectors can be used together as well. And then again, Twitter and HTTP are blocked from usage because they're blocked in at least one of the policies. So you can see that it's the most restrictive set that applies. So a lot of the connector combinations that you may have put in policy A, where SharePoint and Power BI can be used together, are then restricted by other policies, and it fragments the connectors that can be used together in one application. So an app or flow can only use connectors from these individual groups at any given time and not mix connectors across the 8 different groups. So you could have an application that uses SharePoint and Office 365 and then another application that uses SQL in the same environment, but you couldn't have an application that uses SharePoint, Office 365 and SQL in the same application in that environment. So it creates a lot of fragmentation and different I guess you can have then different applications using different connectors in that environment, but not the entire set of connectors that you may have wanted to make available because of that fragmentation. Because of this complexity, we highly recommend that you keep the DLP policies that apply to a single environment to a minimum and regularly triage conflicting or overlapping policies to merge them into a smaller set of policies that aren't overlapping or aren't applied to the same environment.